Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Léonie Allard. I'm a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. My guests today are Dr. Wayne Schroeder and Colonel François Catala. Dr. Schroeder, François, a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Today's Atlantic Debrief is about European military mobility, which is ensuring fast movements of troops and equipment across the continent. The White Paper for European Defense Readiness 2030 has made military mobility a priority. So we're launching today a report that has been in the work for the past month called Enhancing Land Mobility in Europe, Advocating for a Pragmatic Approach. Dr. Schroeder, I'll turn to you for an introduction. You're a non-resident senior fellow at the Transatlantic Security Initiative of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security of the Atlantic Council. You also work at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and you have served as project director for the Atlantic Council's 2020 Military Mobility Task Force report, which looked at very similar issues that we're looking at in today's report. So in your foreword, which you wrote for us, you emphasize the timeliness of this publication and updates. 5 years later, how much progress has been made? How do you assess the situation today?
Well, thank you, Léonie. This is a very important report. When the Council wrote the military mobility report 5 years ago, of course, that was before Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And so what we've seen here in the last 5 years is our major efforts by NATO to come to grips with this Russian aggression and deal with it in terms of its capability, capacity, and readiness, but importantly also in terms of military mobility. When you think about it, just take a look at the map of Europe. The border of Ukraine extends for 1,300 kilometers right up to the Polish border. So this issue becomes critically important for the ability of NATO to be able to defend itself in the context of what it is called its 360-degree defense posture. It needs to defend itself, its eastern flank, and also going NATO south, down to Romania. So these are huge issues. This was recognized at the Hague Summit, where the discussion was to raise military mobility spending, infrastructure spending to 1.5% of GDP. That's a major development since 2020. Also, the 2024 Military Mobility Pledge, which emphasized national commitments of countries. This is important. Countries have to do this nationally. And so getting every country on board becomes critical overall. That pledge emphasized the upgrade of dual-use infrastructure, and it also emphasized, importantly, I think, for NATO Europe and for the EU, of course, short notice movements, and that becomes critically important here as well. And then finally, in November, just this last month, the EU-wide military mobility package, emphasizing movement toward 2027 to a military Schengen, removing regulatory barriers, creating emergency frameworks, readiness of a dual-use infrastructure, the 17.65 billion euro proposal to connect for the Connecting Europe facility, pooling, sharing responsibilities, and then also stronger governance and coordination. All of that has been done really in the last 5 years. That was something that we called for in the 2020 report, that there was going to be more high-level attention paid to this, not just make it a defense planning issue, but raise it, elevate it to the national level, and that's what's been done.
I think it's very much the approach of the study as well to look at whole of government, to not just look at the military side of things, but to really show that this approach needs to be taken into consideration by all sorts of civilian actors as well as military actors. And what's clear in what you've explained right now is that there's lots of political and normative incentives. What I'd like to ask you before turning to the co-author is sort of what are three recommendations for policymakers that we make in the report that you consider to be the most interesting and pressing? We outline no less than 17. So just if you could pick three.
Okay. Well, I did read through the report thoroughly. I went through all the 17. I think all the 17 recommendations should be seriously considered by EU and by NATO. But to pick the top three, this is important, and so I'll try to. It kind of reflects my personal views as well, because my father was in the railroad industry, so the rail proposals I think are very important. Recommendations number 1 and number 13, supporting the standardization of dual-use European rail cars for transport of personnel, wounded people, and equipment, and then also identifying a European budget for the development and acquisition of standardized military flat cars to facilitate military mobility by rail. When you think about the issues, I mean, many of us have seen the videos going, the film going back to World War One and World War II of what happens on the roads. What happens on the roads is there's going to be tremendous number of refugees. There's going to be efforts by people to be able to get out of town, if you will, and also the armies of any antagonists would be using the roads as well to be able to move these kinds of material, not just north, east, west, but also north, south, is going to become very important, I think, for NATO defense. And we have to think of this in the context of going all the way down, not just through Poland, but all the way down to Romania as well, and also having a spur to Ukraine. So that's important, and I think that's something that we should be thinking about. I think also dedicating a large portion of recommendation number 6, a large portion of the budget to large-scale projects targeted by the EU military staff and NATO to bridge capability gaps. Gap analysis is something that we always do in defense planning. And so I would put a tremendous emphasis on number 6 as well. And then I like also number 8, identifying a list of operational shortcomings related to dual-use infrastructures in the joint European Union military staff NATO assessment to encompass the full spectrum of multinational missions in Europe. Those would be the top 3 that I have. And before I leave, Léonie, I would also mention, for those of you who read the report, pay special attention to the maps. There are 3 really fabulous maps in this report. One identifies the corridors of land mobility. It really goes back to World War II and how Germans went across both Ukraine and Poland to get into Russia, but also how that ties into both the defense of Poland and Romania today. And then also the core European ports and freight rail network. That is a fabulous map. And take a good look at that. That's something that can be leveraged heavily. And then I also think there was very good report discussion on the seaports, particularly on the Atlantic coast. That's where the United States can come in and help with reinforcement and resupply. And that's something also that needs to be addressed. Thank you so much, Larry.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for providing these snapshots of some of our most important recommendations. I do hope this motivates people to read the full 17 of them, which stem from a long analysis that we make in this report. Now I'll turn to François. François, you recently graduated from the French War College. You're co-author of this report. You're currently working for the General Secretariat for Defense and National Security. You've had a long military career in the Army. And you have also, most importantly, worked in the Army Operational Headquarters in Paris, where you helped plan the French Army's deployments in Europe. So you're co-authoring from a practitioner's perspective as well. So in this second part of the podcast, we'll be looking chapter by chapter, what are the main topics that we're seeking to address in this study. So the report starts with an assessment of continent-wide gaps for land military mobility. What are the challenges today, according to the report, according to you, to respond to the need for force generation to the eastern flank, given the situation that Dr. Schroeder explained in the introduction?
Well, good evening, everyone. And before answering the question, I would like to, on behalf of my two colleagues, Major Clément Gobert and Major Frédiger, I would like to address a special thank to the obviously to the Atlantic Council for having trusted our analysis and conclusions. And obviously, and as I am a soldier, I would like to thank the French War College for giving us the opportunity to work on that paper. Thank you, obviously, Wayne, for your contribution and insight on our paper. And thank you very much, Léonie, for having led the edition of this report. So to go back to your question, well, the first assumption is the mission of NATO is to deter and ultimately to win wars. And there is obviously no victory in the military field without a concentrated and timely force ratio imposed to the enemy. Well, that being said, the first task of the alliance is to bring the troops to contact. And here starts the interest we have in military mobility. So we do consider that military mobility relies on 5 key points. So the first is the quality and quantity of both military and civilian transport capabilities. Second would be the density and resilience of dual-use infrastructures. Third, an efficient NATO-EU coordination when it comes to developing the said dual infrastructures. And fourth, a whole of government, whole of society approach, as you've mentioned in the foreword, notably when it comes to leveraging civilian resources. And last but not least, this relies on streamlined border crossing procedures. Well, in the field of military capabilities and after the end of the Cold War, most of the Western armies have suffered from several decades of underinvestments, and this has led to common capability gaps, notably in the domains of wide gap crossing, logistics, air defense. And very unfortunately, these capabilities are quite paramount to conduct efficient and tailored military mobility operations. Well, and obviously, as we are Europeans, we are also submitted to our continent's geographical constraints. Roughly, most of the favorable corridors to military mobility in Europe are located in the northern part of the continent, which is currently being exploited quite efficiently by the headquarters, and it has been in the past as well, as Wayne mentioned. And on the other hand, on the southern flank of our continent, the mobility corridor are notably underexploited, and this is creating a misbalance that is quite an issue when it comes to producing strategical effects during the deployment phase.
Thank you so much. So there are many challenges and imbalances in the current picture today. This is what the first part lays out. And in the second part of the report, we look at the existing infrastructures of military mobility. How can they be improved based on the discrepancies that you've described? You qualify the EU's role in this in describing sort of these infrastructures as an operator of that network. What do you mean, and how can we situate the EU as an actor within this plethora of sort of actors that play a role in military mobility?
Well, before answering properly to that question, it's very important to bear in mind that only two transport vectors are able to sustain massive and long-lasting military operations: the sail and the rail. So it means that in that perspective, ports and railroads are obviously key. And these two domains of development are the heart of several public policies led by the European Union. Well, that being said, and in the field of military mobility, on one hand, NATO, as the most efficient military combat organization of the Western world, can be considered the major consumer of military mobility in Europe. Well, and on the other hand, and as the main theater of a likely NATO deployment would be continental Europe, the European Union, can be considered as a major military mobility provider. Well, in this perspective, the EU has a key role to play to coordinate and balance the efforts in the field of military mobility development, especially when it comes to infrastructure development and balancing the efforts and the flux that are running into the continent. This is a public policy that is at the heart of the current negotiations in Brussels, as Wayne mentioned in the forward, as a new military mobility package is currently under construction.
So, within the tools that the EU have to help plan and develop high quality transport infrastructure for civilian and military use, you have a program called Trans-European Transport Network, the TNT, which we describe at length in the report. Why is this program important? What role does it have in what you've just outlined?
Well, actually, the objective of this program is to connect all the networks and core ports and nodes to one another. So, given this connectivity effort made by this program of the TEN-T, this has major impact on the military mobility topic, as these networks will probably be used by the military when the troops will be deployed on the eastern flank. And as I mentioned previously, the efficiency of military mobility is mainly relying on the sail and the rail, and this TEN-T network is currently connecting very accurately and very efficiently the ports to the rails, allowing the troops or the military means that will get into the continent by the Atlantic facade to be fully connected to the area of operations, very probably in the eastern flank of our continent.
So the EU has a lot of tools already. So thank you so much for this overview of what Europe is in this whole picture. Now let's move on to the third part of the studies, where we talk about prioritizing. And despite all these different tools that exist at the EU and NATO, there's sometimes a lack of an integrated vision of military mobility, given that it's not just military actors, given that it's continent-wide, and the geography means that sometimes we need to compensate some of the priorities that naturally go to the north. There are many, many issues that we outline. What does this paper show in terms of addressing the most pressing operational vulnerabilities?
Well, as you mentioned, during the first exercises of the Action Plan on Military Mobility, there was a clear lack of coordination between the customer, it means NATO, and the provider, the European Union. And things are getting way better. Now, NATO is fully associated to the validation process of the projects pushed by the member states when it comes to improving the dual-use infrastructures. The problem during the second exercise of the Action Plan of Military Mobility is that all the projects were attributed in the very beginning of the mandate of the plan, meaning that all the projects that were submitted after all the resources were completely out were not taken into account. And this has created another imbalance in the way that all the projects were distributed around the continent. It means that this integration, as I mentioned in the introduction, is key to ensure that the needs of NATO as a major military operator are met by the main military mobility provider, the European Union.
So now let's go to the role of the private sector, which is the fourth part of the study. Their institutional actors can also help set norms to address some key issues, but member states have to apply these norms, of course. So where does this report leave the role of the private sector? What are some of the key progresses that could be sort of incentivized by the institutional side?
Historically, the war burden was not only war by the military side, but by the whole society, including the private sector. That was the case during the First World War, where, for instance, France has contracted all the transportation, almost all the transportation, 90% of the transportation, to the civilian enterprises. So this is giving us a historical feedback on the fact that if we are going to war, we will need the private sector to transport our troops and materials from point A to point B, from the ports to the front line, for instance. And in that field, some countries in Europe have developed an internal regulations and laws allowing the state to contract or to use the civilian means for military purpose. This is framed by laws. Some countries have not. So in the recent military mobility package, as it was a recommendation as well of our paper, the EU is trying to incentive the member states to develop these very requisition mechanisms within their own countries. But this is the limit of the EU. They cannot impose, even if it's a regulation, things that might not go that might not fit, the legal framework of the countries. And in the end, the European countries will still remain sovereigns in this field. And I would just like to stress on one particular point is that, for instance, when it comes to road transport in Europe, most of the truck fleets are owned by a couple of companies distributed in a couple of countries. The truck drivers, for instance, are mainly relying on workforce that is coming from the East and Poland mainly. It means that in times of war, countries like Poland will probably need this workforce for their own needs. And this will impact the availability of the transportation means all across the Union. So there is a balance to find between, obviously, sovereignty and the principle of reality when it comes to dealing with this requisition mechanism.
Right, that's very interesting to kind of show that planning and training and, looking at real-time crisis scenarios is going to need to go way beyond, again, the military realm and take into account a whole of society approach, according to what you're saying. And I think the report really details, very interestingly, different types of requisition mechanisms that have existed in the past, and historically the relationship that countries may have with those types of policies, which I found really interesting. Finally, let's go to the final fifth part of the report, where we call for a military Schengen area. What would be a military Schengen, and especially what would this imply for the EU-NATO cooperation?
Well, the basic idea behind the concept of military Schengen is to streamline the border crossing movements within the Union. And this obviously has an impact on the national rules and the sovereignty I mentioned before, like just like the case of the regulation. Well, the objective is to use the normative power of the European Union to iron out all these custom procedures that might hamper the ability of the states and the ability of NATO to move troops from point A to point B. And obviously, this is submitted to the adoption of common procedures, mainly the EU Form 302, which is at 2 lines, very similar to the NATO custom form. This is so relying on common tools, common understanding, common rules, and this requires that the member states of the European Union just apply the regulation proposed by the European Union, obviously in full respect with their own national prerogatives and sovereignty domain, but no additional procedure or no additional administrative layer should be added to these procedures that are going to be implemented with the European regulation on military mobility, because this kind of administrative millefeuille is really what is hampering the ability of the NATO to move troops. So the first point is obviously administrative, and this can be ruled by the European Union, and this will have to be adopted by the member states to their own regulation for the benefits of the greater good.
Right. So there's a lot of possible duplications that may be addressed, but also a need for streamlining that needs to be addressed by the member states as well as the European Union in providing incentives and trying to manage a more simple administrative framework for mobility. We're nearing the end of our time, so let me just close with a simple question. With everything that's been happening recently that you've described in Europe, and especially because this report was part of the civil society consultative process of the European Commission for the preparation of the package, we have been following and tracking a lot of the developments that have been going on recently. How do you assess these developments? Maybe Dr. Schroeder first.
Well, I think the future is far brighter on military mobility today than it was 5 years ago when the Council launched the 2020 report. There's been so much movement at the national level, and what is happening here is that the defense thought leadership throughout the countries is gelling in a very, very positive way to be able to get these issues up to the national decision-making level. I think Colonel Catala and his other writers, officers Gaubert and Gier, I hope I pronounced that correctly, should be commended because of what they've done here. They're following on in a very, very important way. There's been so much in the United States written admonishing the Europeans to do more on defense. This is an area where they're doing more. This is an area the U.S. defense establishment and the political leadership of this country should get behind 100%, because this is going to make a difference overall in terms of deterrence and defense of the eastern flank and also the southern tier. And I want to thank, of course, again, the Council for taking the leadership and following up on this and not letting it languish. Thank the Council very, very much for its interest in this area.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schroeder, for your help as well in shaping the report. And
I'll be more than willing to do it again and again.
what about François? Do you have any reactions to what Dr. Schroeder just said?
Yes, I would just like to point out that when we started our research around military mobility back in September 2024, all the recommendations that we found, the findings of this paper, are now for some part of this military mobility package, and it has only been like 10 months, less than a year. So the progress made on this military mobility topic are very fast, because there is a sense of urgency to make things move, as Wayne underlined, on the topic of military mobility. And now, with this new regulation coming, I guess we have reached some kind of conceptual maturity of the military mobility aspect. And we are now at the crossroads. Now it's going to be the time to apply this regulation and the contents of this regulation, and to find a kind of balance between what is necessary to military mobility, and what is acceptable for the member states when it comes to sovereignty. We have been moving forward very fast on this topic, and now it's time to find a balance, I guess. And this balance is gonna be found during the discussions, the negotiation around this military mobility package. And once this balance will be found, and this will be the time for another acceleration of the topic and the project development mentioned by Wayne. So now we are at the crossroads. It's a very interesting moment for this topic of military mobility, and I'm very happy we could do some research on this paper, and we are very happy that that the Atlantic Council found an interest in the findings we had. Thank you very much.
With this, we reach the conclusion of our podcast. Thank you so much for listening. For all our viewers as well, you can find the report online. We'll provide a link in our social media and on our platforms. And as it was said by both our speakers, Europe is stepping up for its own defense. And the US should also be watching that closely. I hope that we'll do some more content on this. Please read the report, come to our events, and thank you very much.